Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Efron. I'm the director of this Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm also a professor in the history department, professor of Jewish history. Today's talk is brought to us by the Center for Jewish Studies, along with the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, and the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. So thank you to the Institute and to BCSR for their co-sponsorship. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to, I guess it's this evening almost, or close enough, this conversation that will take place here on the theme of Satmar, Hasidism, history, ideology, and sociology. And we'll be hearing from two really wonderful scholars who are going to be in dialogue with each other, Dr. Menachem Keren-Kratz and Adi Sherzer-Druckman. Satmar Hasidism, the topic of today's talk, is just one aspect of the fascinating and actually little known history of Judaism in general in Hungary. And in fact, I would go further that it's one of the great pities of those of us who do modern Jewish history that Hungarian Jewry, which was a gigantic community, almost 1 million on the eve of the Holocaust, there's very little work done on Hungarian Jewry in general, sort of relative to other Jewish communities, and there's bigger literature on far smaller communities. So just from that fact alone, for anyone who works on Hungary, Menachem, we're very grateful because it's so important. The Satmar sect is also very important, not just in terms of history of Hungarian Judaism, but it also is an important part of American Judaism and also American history writ large. While Satmar originated in Hungary in the early 20th century, they came to the United States, and with the migration and founder of the sect, the Grand Rebbe Yoel Teitelbaum, came in 46. And since that time, we will hear about it, but it's grown enormously. And in fact, it's set up its own community, Kiryas, where it's actually a municipality and with its own elected local government. And so Satmar is a potent force in American Judaism, although it seems that it's separated from everyone. And they're vehemently anti-modern, but what is interesting is how they achieved their status, their independent status in Kiryas, which is in upstate New York, by using the American legal system, by using the internet, by using all of the things that they are ostensibly against as a way of working the system. So who's going to be telling us about this? Menachem Keren-Kratz is an independent scholar who completed a PhD in 2009 in Yiddish literature at Bar Ilan in Israel. And in 2013, because one PhD wasn't enough, he did a second PhD, this time in Jewish history at Tel-Aviv University. And his first book is entitled Maramaros-Sziget, Extreme Orthodoxy and Secular Jewish Culture at the Foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. And his most recent book, The Zealot, the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. And he also has a forthcoming book. Those two volumes are in Hebrew, but he has a forthcoming book in English entitled Zealotry and Piety, Jewish Hungarian Orthodoxy. He's also published more than 60 articles in Hebrew and English in both leading academic journals and also publications geared towards the general public. And we are very grateful that Menachem reached out to us, and we're very fortunate that his sister lives in Sunnyvale, and he's come to visit her. And so we'll be able to combine a talk from him and he having a family visit. Now, in response to Menachem, we have Adi Sherzer, and we're very fortunate to be hosting him, not only for the conversation today, but also for the entire academic year, where he is currently a Fulbright Fellow at UC Berkeley's Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. He's a historian who focuses on the relationship between the culture of the Israeli Republic and the Jewish past. Among other things, his research touches on Israel-diaspora relations, Israeli national holidays, Israeli military education, and the thin borderlines between nationalism and religion. Adi's PhD focused on the place of Jewish symbols, rituals, and traditions during the first Israeli independence days. And his current project focuses on the formation of the Israeli chief rabbinate as a sort of a state church, as it were, during the 1940s and 1950s. He was head of the Research Forum for the Study of Liberal Judaism and Jewish Renewal at the Azriela Center for Israel Studies at Ben Gurion, and he's previously been a fellow in Germany at the Max Weber Kolleg, and he has also published in major academic journals, including Middle Eastern Studies and the Journal of Religious History. So what we're going to do today is that Menachem is going to speak for about 30 minutes. Adi will then respond to him for about 15 minutes, and then Menachem may wish to respond to Adi's response. If not, we will then open the floor, as it were, the virtual floor, to the audience. And what I would ask you to do is please don't call out, but place your questions in the chat. And then I'll be able to put them to both Menachem and to Adi. So with that, welcome to both of you. And we'll turn it over to Menachem.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction. First, of course, I want to thank you, Professor Efron, and the members of the Center for Jewish Studies for inviting me to deliver this talk, and also to Dr. Adi Sherzer, who agreed to comment. Second, I wish to warn everybody that I'm using this opportunity to test some of my ideas by stretching them more than I have done in the past, and you will soon understand what I'm talking about. In 2020, last year, I published the first academic biography dealing with Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. This is the book here, hope you can see it. The Satmar Rebbe, which was based on my PhD dissertation. However, because the publisher set strict limits on the length of the book, I had to disregard a large section of the dissertation, which dealt with the life of Rabbi Yoel in America. I hope that in the future, I'll be able to gather the funds required for translating this text and to publish a book in English, which will be entirely devoted to the history of Satmar in America. In the following, I will present my general outlook on this subject. I'll begin now by making three claims. First, the Jewish society, which evolved both in Israel and in other countries after the Holocaust, was completely different to that which existed until then. This was manifested in all aspects of life, including the social, religious, and political. Moreover, what was true for the Jewish society in general was particularly true for the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi society. Second, Haredi spokespersons and even most scholars suggest that Hasidism is a historical movement which, despite almost being annihilated during the Holocaust, was able to rise from the ashes and resume its glorious past. I disagree. I claim that despite some superficial resemblance, post-Holocaust Hasidism is a completely different phenomenon. This is reflected in all aspects of Hasidic lifestyle, including the Hasidic court's sociological structure, the education system, the Hasidic inner politics, and the Hasidic economic system, to name but a few. Third, despite Satmar Hasidim often refer to their court's pre-Holocaust glory, as well as to the reputation of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe, that reputation which he had in Europe, both claim are highly doubtful. The court in Satmar had no more than a few hundred devoted Hasidim, while all the rest were incidental visitors. The Satmar Rebbe himself was only known by a small circle of Hungarian rabbis, all living in its vicinity. His reputation was nowhere near that of the fame and prestige of the head of the Lithuanian heads of yeshiva, the leader of the great Orthodox communities in Poland, or the members of Agudat Israel Council of Sages. In fact, for most of his life in Europe, he was not even considered a firm opponent of Zionism. In light of these assertions, I claim that what we now know as Satmar Hasidism is in fact an American phenomenon, and that scholars should observe it wearing American glasses, so to quote. In other words, Satmar Hasidism should be viewed as an endeavor aimed at fulfilling the religious version of the American dream. Consequently, in order to properly study this quote and to evaluate its achievement as well as its shortcomings, it should not be compared with Eastern Europe's pre-Holocaust Hasidic courts, nor with Haredi communities in Israel. Rather, it should be judged against a variety of religious organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish, which were established in the United States after World War II. Now I wish to go to a short biographical introduction. Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum was born in 1887 in the town of Sziget, Hungary. His father was the town's chief rabbi, the leader of the local Hasidic court, the head of a large yeshiva, and a political activist in the Orthodox Bureau, which was Hungary's main Orthodox organization. Because Yoel was the youngest son, he was not destined to succeed his father in any of his roles. After his father's death, the 18 years old Yoel, who just got married, was driven out of Sziget as to not interfere with his brothers taking over their father's positions. Even after his older brother passed away in 1926 at a young age, Sziget's community leaders refused to appoint Rabbi Yoel as the chief rabbi. Frustrated by the refusal, Rabbi Yoel was determined to do everything in his power to achieve all the position he felt he has been deprived of. It took him 6 years of an uphill struggle to be appointed as a chief rabbi in Satmar, a position he achieved only in 1934, and another 3 years to be elected to the Orthodox Bureau, and finally to achieve all his political goals. Soon thereafter, however, World War II and the Holocaust descended. At that time, Rabbi Yoel made several tries to escape from Europe, but failed. In 1944, when his entire community in Satmar was crammed into the ghetto, he finally fled, was caught, and sent to another ghetto. Eventually, he was rescued by the Kastner train. After the war ended, he settled in Eretz Israel and tried to establish a Hasidic community, yet failed. Persecuted by his creditor, he was forced to go to the United States in order to collect money to save his institutions, but failed once again. Eventually, he decided to settle in America. This is where the story of Satmar Hasidism begins. Now, we should consider the situation. The Satmar Rebbe gets to America. He's almost 60 years old. He speaks no English or no other European language except from Yiddish. He is quite old. He doesn't have any Hasidim in the United States because he objected for his Hasidim to immigrate to other countries. He's moving from one community to another, trying to raise funds to save his crumbling institution in Jerusalem, but he's doing very miserably in that. Finally, he realizes that he's not going to return to Eretz Israel, then still not the state of Israel. He's meeting with a lot of rabbis. He discovered that many rabbis whom he knew in Hungary or in Romania before the war, who were anti-Zionists, when they came to the United States after the Holocaust, they became practically Zionists. They support the establishment of a Jewish state to absorb the Holocaust survivors, and he's really kind of find a place for himself in that community. In all that, he has one thing that is going for him, which makes him a unique figure among all the other rabbis, which is his very strict position on Orthodoxy. In Hungary, there was a special situation, not unlike any other in any other European country. In Hungary, Orthodoxy had a position by itself. I mean, the Orthodox communities were separated from the non-Orthodox communities, and that also allowed a separate Orthodox branch to develop there, which I called extreme Orthodoxy. Extreme Orthodoxy is more or less equivalent to what we would call the fundamentalist wing of Jewish Orthodoxy, which means that there is mainstream Orthodoxy, which is considered by the extreme Orthodox too lenient, and there is the extreme Orthodox, which they consider to be like more of true Jews. And this is what the concept, the ideology that Rabbi Yoel has in his deck of cards, which is unique compared to other rabbis. So he's trying to promote this ideology, this extreme ideology. In order to do that, he cannot just argue that he is more strict in observing the halacha, but he needs to find something which is really unique to him. And what was generally accepted amongst all rabbis in America, either those who came many years before to the United States, and even those who came after the Holocaust, was the more or less pro-Zionist attitudes. That was the general concept of Jewish Orthodoxy in America. In that sense, Rabbi Yoel is the only one who actually fights against the establishment of a Jewish state and later on against Israel. So in all his travels around the various Orthodox communities, he discovers that there is a bunch of people, of Orthodox people, who actually like to follow this extreme worldview. It's a minority, it's not a large group, perhaps at the beginning, a few dozen families, but still it's a beginning. So when he eventually gives up on the idea of returning back to Eretz Israel, with this group of followers, which at the beginning contained only 70 people, he established the Satmar Hasidic group, which in fact, unlike other Hasidic communities which are based on the same place of origin, namely, for example, the court of Bobov, is mainly Hasidim who came from the town or village of Bobov, and then they created their own community. And then when the Rebbe came after the Holocaust, they nominated him as the Rebbe. But with Satmar, it wasn't the case. Satmar was a community which was based on the same idea, not on the same location. But Satmar still continues to develop his community, and he is using his, what we would call charisma, in order to attract more and more people. And he is promoting a unique ideology which focuses on his anti-Zionist an anti-modern and even anti-American worldview, which he promotes. And there is a group of people, a group of Hasidim, who adhere to him, and they establish the basic Hasidic community, which later be known as Satmar Hasidism. In order to develop his community, and because already in Eastern Europe, Rabbi Yoel was already known as a shrewd politician, as someone who knows how to move from having an abstract idea into practical manifestation of that idea, he realizes that in order to develop his court, he needs to do two things. First is to present himself as the most radical rabbi living in America after the Holocaust. This would make him unique and make the people who follow him feel unique as well, because there is no one standing further away in that region. So this is one thing. So he is claiming that he is going to establish a community which will resemble a Jewish pre-Holocaust shtetl. This is his claim. On the other hand, as all other politicians knows, there is a gap between what you declare you're going to do and what you are going to do in practice. So when he declares that he is going to establish an East European shtetl, that's a declaration. In reality, what he's doing is taking many steps which are quite modern and which were inconceivable in the shtetls from which he came. For example, he decides to open up an education system for boys, which means because in America there is a mandatory education law, and that mandatory law requires that all children will be exposed to general studies. When he opens his so-called yeshiva or Talmud Torah, this is a place in which the children are also exposed to general studies, to English studies, to mathematics, to geography, to history, to all sorts of information. And this kind of combination, namely that the same institution, a student studied both holy studies and general studies, this was inconceivable in the towns in which Rabbi Yoel came from. Not only that, but he also opens a school for girls. In girls in Transylvania, in the places where Rabbi Yoel came from, in Hungary, girls were not only taught general studies, but were not exposed to holy studies as well, because this is forbidden by the Torah. So this is another step which goes against what he actually, which is a gap between what he declares and what he is actually doing. Moreover, he is also establishing summer camps. Summer camp is also a new idea. It's an American idea. Nobody in Eastern Europe went to a summer camp. But this is also something new. He's also establishing his own newspaper. All the rabbis in Hungary were very much against any sort of newspaper. Even a religious newspaper was a big no-no in that time. He goes on in that trend in many other endeavors which he develops, and in a way, this is part of his success. I mean, making his Hasidim believe that they are part of some sort of European shtetl on the one hand, but on the other hand, giving them the opportunity to be more educated, to have better jobs, to have their daughters be better educated, to give them the same condition, the same level of education that other Orthodox Jews have. For example, to run his institutions, he does not pick a Satmar Chassid, he actually picks someone from Agudat Israel, which is his ideological rival, but he lets him run the institution because he is the one who knows how to deal and how to compete with the other institutions which are offering education to the ultra-Orthodox communities. So this goes on in many other aspects. John before mentioned the establishment of a special town which is called Kiryas Joel. He actually tried to establish this town in the beginning of the 1950s. He encountered many problems in that. He went from one place to another, and in each place, when they discovered that the area was destined to host a bunch of Hasidism, there was a great antagonism from the local population, and eventually the municipality blocked that initiative. Eventually, however, in order to fulfill this dream of his, he actually sent someone incognito who doesn't look, he chooses someone who doesn't look like a Hasid, doesn't even look like a Jew. He wears a wig over his head as to not wear a cap or a yarmulke, so nobody would suspect that this guy is in fact an Orthodox Jew, and he is the one which is doing all the work which is required to purchase the land, to do all the development there. Only when things are almost complete, then the people of the town of Monroe, which is where Kiryas Joel is located, they realize that the man who had made all the handling with the local municipality was in fact a Haredi Jew, and of course they resented, they're very angry with them, but that was too late for them to change the plans. This also shows you that Rabbi Yoel was on the one hand stating the support in a religious ideology which forbids to quarrel with the Gentiles, but on the other hand, when he needed to do it, he didn't hesitate in doing so, even though he realized he was making many people angry. And this goes on throughout his career in the United States. For example, everybody knows that the Satmar Rebbe was very much anti-Zionist, and he was even more than anti-Zionist. He was against the state of Israel, which he considered the ultimate sin. He considered it such a great sin that sin is considered like all the other sins combined. This is how they describe the sin of the establishment of the state of Israel. This is at the ideological level. However, in practice, he decided to establish his own community there in the town of Bnei Barak. When he decided to establish this community in Bnei Barak was a small town in which the community, the Haredi community, composed only 20% of the population. And yet he decides to establish his community in Bnei Barak, and not in Jerusalem, which is considered a holy city, but in Bnei Barak, which is much more modern and more convenient for Hasidim to settle, because there is better job opportunities there. So he's sending his emissaries, and they deal with the local municipality, they deal with Israeli ministers in order to get loans and in order to get the permits to build his neighborhood there. He's dealing with the Israeli contractors. He's dealing with Israeli banks to finance the Salt project. He's hiring Israeli engineers and Israeli professionals to do all the technical work needed for that. Israeli architects, whatever it takes to build his community. Yet when the community, when the neighborhood is built, he is telling the world that this is an an extreme Orthodox community. It will not. It does not obey the Jewish state. It does not obey the Jewish government. His Hasidim is totally connected from the Zionist establishment, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, again, when in 1955 Rabbi Yoel visits Israel, then the state of Israel, it's not his first visit, but it's his fourth visit to Israel. He comes just before the election. At that time, in 1955, there are two sets of elections going simultaneously. There's an election for the parliament, and there is election for the municipality. And when Rabbi Yoel arrives at Eretz Israel, he goes very much against the rabbis, the Haredi rabbis, the ultra-Orthodox rabbis, who support the Haredi parties who run for the Israeli parliament. But when some people suggest that he should also oppose the election to the municipalities, for example, in Bnei Barak, he says no. This is a different. But you should vote, and it is a mitzvah to vote for the local municipality, because this can influence your life. So there's a great discrepancy there, and of course, the radical people, the ultra-Orthodox, and they go against him, claiming that they're pointing to his hypocrisy, that he makes a distinction between this type of election and the other type of election. So this is another example how he promotes his interests regardless of his declared ideology. And this is, in a way, the secret to his success. I can give you many more examples like that, but the last one, because of time restriction, I will only give you another example. In Israel, after the Holocaust, because the Haredi Judaism, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, suffered a major blow, all the Torah institutions in Israel and Europe were destroyed, and a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews perished during the Holocaust, more than they share in the general population, because they were less inclined to immigrate to other countries. So the Torah sages who were rescued after the Holocaust decided that they should strengthen the word of Torah. And how would they do that? They have encouraged the young Orthodox men to remain in the yeshiva even after they are married. They encourage the women, the Orthodox women, to go to work and to support the family in order to allow the man to remain in the yeshiva and continue his studies and to become what is known in Hebrew, in the Jewish culture, as Talmid Chacham, a sage in the Torah. I mean, that not only the few best students will be a Talmid Chacham, but everybody should become a Talmid Chacham, and this is how the Torah world in general will be saved, because there will be more people who are more knowledgeable in the world of Torah, in the study, especially the study of Talmud. So this was the atmosphere which went on in Israel, and also among some rabbis in America. However, the Satmar Rebbe, who is apparently more interested in growing his own community, he disagreed to this practice, and he practically said, everybody, every Hasid who finishes his studies in the yeshiva at the age of 17 or 18, he gets married, right away he has to go to work. Only a handful of students will continue their studies, only those which have the potential to become rabbis or heads of yeshiva or teachers in yeshiva, only a few will continue their studies afterwards. So most of the Hasidim just finish their studies in the yeshiva and go right away to work. In order to assist them, he makes special committees who work hand in hand with the local government, the local city government, which helps them to get a proper professional education, helps them get loans to open the business, helps them to get all the practical necessities in order for them to open their own businesses. He organizes, for example, special buses to take them to the Diamond Center in Manhattan, so it would be easier for them to go there and come back. He's taking care of all the necessities in order to encourage them to work, to make money, to make a good living for themselves, and of course, by his Hasidim having more money, because they have to donate some of their income to the court becomes extremely rich. And this whole set of conditions, both the ideology and the practical way of life which he promotes, is a big success for not only for his Hasidim, but for other Hasidim as well as for other ultra-Orthodox Jews who were not at the beginning so attracted to Hasidism, but later on, as they see the success of the Satmar court, they begin to approach him, and eventually his court goes from one day to another. And then, if he established his court in 1948, 10 years later, by 1958, it is already the largest Hasidic court in the United States. And this trend continues to grow throughout his lifetime. He passed away in 1979. He was succeeded first by his nephew, and then by his nephew's two sons, who also continued on the same line, namely that promote extreme ideology on one hand, but very practical way of life on the other. And the result is that Satmar Hasidim today is a community of about 120,000 people, roughly between 25 and 30,000 families. It is perhaps the largest Jewish education system in America, and this is a success of the Satmar Hasidic court. I just want to go back to the beginning and remind all of you that while today Satmar Hasidic is very known in America, in fact, it's known beyond the border of the Jewish people. I mean, many Americans, especially those living in the East Coast, they know the term Satmar. But at the time, in Eastern Europe, Satmar was only known to the local people living in Transylvania. The Satmar Rebbe was also unknown, practically unknown to most Orthodox Jews living in Eastern Europe. And this is the difference between what Eastern Europe had to offer to Hasidism and what America had to offer to Hasidism since then. So we can speak about the Satmar court Diori in Eastern Europe, which perhaps had 300 Hasidim back then, and perhaps another 1,000 followers or admirers from a part. And nowadays, beside the Satmar court, which has 120,000 Hasidim, there is about a crowd, say, of the same size of other Hasidic courts, and a crowd of ultra-Haredi Jews in Israel, which are known as Eda Haredi, to also follow the ideology of the Satmar Rebbe.
Okay, Menachem, thank you. I think we'll hear from Adi now, and then he'll respond to some of your comments, and then we'll take it from there and open up the floor. But thank you very much. Adi?
So I'm joining John in thanking Menachem for the fascinating presentation. It is indeed a very interesting subject. It's something that always speaking about the unknown is interesting, but in the case of Satmar, it's the known unknown, because this is a Hasidic court that everyone have heard of, but I'm not sure that basically I can say that I'm pretty sure that most of us are not fully aware to the story behind it. And so first, thank you, Menachem, and thank you also to John and to the center for giving me the opportunity to respond to this lecture. I'll try to be as brief as possible in order to leave enough time for our audience today to ask their questions. And the main thing that I'll try to do is to contextualize what Menachem suggests, what Menachem presented today, and suggest a few frameworks to understand the case of Satmar Hasidism and the fascinating book that Menachem wrote. And I'm joining you, Menachem, in the hope that it would be translated and elaborated, and will also address some issues that are more related to the current Satmar community in the United States. So the first context of what we hear today, as I see it, is the huge stream of new research that is focusing on the ultra-Orthodox society, both in Israel and the States. I can just name few recent researchers that were focusing on questions of both historical questions and more up-to-date questions that are related to the ultra-Orthodox community. So Alexander Kay and Daniel Mala and Ada Gebel, who wrote a fascinating book in Israel about Poalei Agudat Israel, maybe the other part of the spectrum of the ultra-Orthodox society, the more Zionist part of it. And moving to people that are writing about current day Haredic society, like Lee Kahaner and Chaim Zicherman, and Nava Wasserman, Nissim Leon, and others that are focusing on the different fractions of the ultra-Orthodox society. And of course, those who are writing about the Zealots in the ultra-Orthodox society, in the Haredi society, which are mostly Menachem and Kimi Kaplan. And I think it's not coincidental that we see so much research on this subject in the past few years, maybe a decade, but not more than that. I think it's deeply related to both what we used to call the post-secular turn, the understanding that we're not living in a completely secular world, but religion has a place in modern world and in postmodern world, and it's not only part of the past; it's also part of the present. It's also part of the future, because those religious institutions, those religious community, that the assumption was that modernity will completely disrupt, are still here and are still relevant today. But it also have another part of that, and I think Menachem really picks it up when he speaks about the Satmar Hasidim, and this is the fact that Haredi society, Haredi ideas, ultra-Orthodoxy in general, from the most latent one to the Zealots, is the modern phenomenon. And Satmar is a modern phenomenon, and Shas is a modern phenomenon, and Neturei Karta is a modern phenomenon, and Agudat Israel is a modern phenomenon. And this is something that is very different from the way that ultra-Orthodox society used to present itself to outsiders. And I think this is something that is really important to remember, and this is the wider context of the fascinating things that we heard today. This understanding that the Haredi society, the Haredi communities, are not an anachronistic phenomenon, but they are part of the modern world, is also something that that brings me to the second context that I want to mention today, and I would like to maybe to pick it up from a personal place. My father was born in a city called Baia Mare, on the border between Hungary and Romania. And a few years ago, we went to a trip together with him in order to see the place where he lived, and it's really, I think it's not, maybe Menachem will correct me, but it's not very far away, only a few kilometers from Shatu Mare, which is Satmar. Menachem's fathers also grew up at the same region, and it was rather interesting to look at this, to look at the landscape, to look at the place where Satmar Hasidim have started. And really, in a complete coincidence, I had a conference that was canceled a few weeks afterwards. After visiting Satmar in Romania, I visited Kiryas out of curiosity and out of free time. And I had the opportunity to compare between the both. So of course, the comparison is not accurate, because Satmar today is not a Jewish shtetl at all. I think there are almost no Jews out there. But it was rather interesting because it's something that you can really sense and understand. Those are two very different phenomena. And although Kiryas Yoel may be a kind of shtetl, this is a very different kind of shtetl than the East European shtetl. And in this context, I think that we should bear in mind that ultra-Orthodoxies keep changing, and these shtetls keep changing. And thus, in this context, those of you that will Google it will find that in recent years there is an attempt to build a new Haredi city in Mexico called Ciudad de la Torah, that also takes it into another level and also wants to create something new. So there is a continuity. There is a line that connects those shtetls, but there's also lots and lots of differences. And the line of continuity, and this is my third context that I want to mention today. This continuity is deeply connected with the term or the attempt to create a language of authenticity. It is really, when reading Menachem's book, it is really clear that Rabbi Yoel had this deep usage of what is supposed to be an authentic language, of speaking of authenticity, of preserving the old way of life, of preserving the the true Jewish way of life from East Europe to the States. And in this context, I think it's rather interesting to bear in mind that this is another interesting modern phenomenon that we can see in different parts of Jewish society, and not necessarily in those parts that consider themselves as traditional. And I'm saying that because while thinking of that, I thought about the complete opposite of Rabbi Yoel, and this is the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. Because David Ben-Gurion, in a very different way, is using the same attempt of creating an authenticity, creating something which is ostensibly more authentic. In the case of David Ben-Gurion, in the case of Israel, in his discourse, the authenticity is the biblical authenticity. It is ostensibly more authentic than exilic life. But in both cases, in both very different cases, you can see the same quest for an authentic Jewish existence, for something that preserving the past, for something that is relying on the past and not only creating something new. I find it very not very surprising in the context of people like Rabbi Yoel, but I think that while looking at them, we can understand that the quest for authenticity is actually something that is common to also very different parts of Jewish society. And my last context, or my last comment, if you like, is and it's something that is also related to the question of the question that was posted in the chat. I think it's rather interesting to look at the mutual need of Israel and Satmar in each other. As again, and Menachem, I'm welcoming you to argue with me about that. It seems as if
Adi, can I just say, because you mentioned the question in the chat, let me just read the question in the chat for people, because they can't see what you refer to. So someone asked, and we shouldn't take it for granted that everyone knows, why did Rabbi Yoel consider the foundation of the state of Israel to be such an unforgivable sin? So that was the question that was posed, and that's the one that you referred to in the
yes,
chat.
and I will let Menachem explain it in more details. The only thing that I would like to say in this context is that, as I see it, Rabbi Yoel needed the state of Israel as a symbol for a very different Jewish existence in order to create his version of Judaism. And I think that we can say the same thing about the state of Israel. I think that in many ways, the state of Israel needs people like Rabbi Yoel. It needs that the Israeli discourse needs that in order to distinguish itself from other versions of Jewish existence. And maybe, if I'm going back to my previous comment, maybe this is something that both sides use in order to present themselves as more authentic, their version of Judaism as more authentic. So those were my 4 comments for this fascinating presentation. And once again, thank you for enlightening us in this fascinating case study. So okay. Menachem, I guess it goes to you now.
John, you will do the allocation from now on. Okay, so I said it. Okay, I want to answer the first question, because I said that John is not answering me. So
I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything. What did you say?
Okay.
I think there was a cut in the.
It cut out. What did you?
I was just asking you to run this discussion here, to decide who speaks and which.
That's what I'm doing. So the question that was put to you was, why did he consider the foundation of the state of Israel to be such an unforgivable sin?
Okay. So basically, the basic concept is that according to certain ultra-Orthodox tradition, the people of Israel was driven out of Eretz Israel, the Holy Land, because of the sins he committed during the Second Temple. From that on, the Jewish people is supposed to remain in the diaspora until God decides to redeem him. And they should stay, Jewish people in general should stay in the diaspora, suffer whatever they need to suffer until they repent or until otherwise God decides the time has come for the redemptions. Okay. When the national Jewish movement, namely Zionism, decided to strive to establish a Jewish state, the ultra-Orthodox interpret it as their disbelief in God's will or intention or potential to redeem his people. I mean, they claim that what the Zionists did was an act of heresy, because the Zionists no longer believed that God intended to salvage his people, to redeem his people, and therefore why they decided to go by themselves. This is a collective act of heresy, according to the Satmar Rebbe and according to several other rabbis. And this is such a grave act of heresy that the only possible punishment for such a great sin was the Holocaust. This was Rabbi Yoel's argument, which was also, on the one hand, against the state of Israel, but on the other hand, also explained the Holocaust as a consequence of what the Zionists have done before the establishment of the state of Israel and after the establishment of the state of Israel. This is the religious argument. I just want to continue.
I want to get to some other. I want to make sure that everyone's question gets asked. So there's another question, and maybe you can speak about what you were going to say in this question. Jacqueline Adams writes, "Thank you for your talk about this interesting movement and leader. Could you tell us more about the people who joined his community, and in particular, what needs they may have had to which they perceived his community to be a response?"
Okay, thank you for the question. It's really very fascinating because there are actually two groups of people who joined the Satmar Hasidic court in the early years. First were the Holocaust survivors, who came directly from the concentration camps for the DP camps into America. They, in a way, were not corrupted, so to speak, by the American way of life. They came from their own shtetls, real shtetls in Eastern Europe. They came to America. They looked for the best place for them to continue their life where they were stopped by the Holocaust. And many of them found the most appropriate place in the Satmar Hasidic court. So this is one group of people who actually didn't have to change much between what they knew before the Holocaust and what they encountered after the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust in Hungary began in 1944. By 1945, it was already after the Holocaust. A year or two afterwards, they were already in the United States. So it was almost a continuation for them from where they stopped in that way of life. The other group, perhaps the most surprising group, is a group of people, not necessarily of Hungarian descent, who came before the Holocaust to America. And those were all Orthodox Jews who came to America only to discover that the meaning of the term Orthodoxy in America was not the same as the term that they have known in Eastern Europe. I mean, in Eastern Europe, when you say that you are an Orthodox Jew, that meant that you are an observant Jew. You try to observe the mitzvot as much as you can. That was the meaning of Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe. When they came to America, they discovered that the term Orthodox was to describe a person who belonged to a community which was titled Orthodox, but in which most of the people were not really observant Jews. I mean, the observant was perhaps the rabbi, but the members of the congregation, many of them were not really Orthodox Jews. So when they discovered that there is an Orthodox community which followed the Orthodox tradition in the Eastern European sense, they sought to team up with that group, even though some of them were not Hungarian, many of them were not even Hasidim. But since that was the only option, or one of the only options open for them, so they joined that particular group.
Okay, so we've got quite a few more questions now, Menachem. So let me get to some of them. One comes from our colleague here, Alec Burko, who teaches Yiddish, and he says, "Can you talk about Rabbi Yoel's charisma? Because listening to him, he sounds almost incomprehensible."
Well, obviously, no one knows what charisma is. Yes, I mean, you know it exists, but it's very hard to describe. But first of all, he was really known as someone who could see to people's heart. He had a great sense of humor, which is something that usually we're not trying to relate to people who hold to zealous ideas, but apparently he had a sense of humor. He knew how to carry a sermon. He wasn't very strong in writing books. In fact, he only wrote one book during his lifetime, but he was very good in making good long sermons, and he had a solid ideology, which was also a good point in favor of him. So basically, this is what I can say about this enigma of charisma, which I wasn't really able to decipher much more than that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask the question that's posed by my other colleague in the linguistics department, Isaac Bleeman, who, describes himself. I research Hasidic Yiddish, and a number of the people I work with from New York-based communities are not Satmar, but Satmar gestimmt. That means Satmar-oriented. What are the main differences between Satmar gestimmt and non-Satmar gestimmt in the landscape of American Hasidic communities?
Well, basically, as I said before, Satmar was a very successful movement. However, it was a big Hasidic court, and there are a lot of Hasidim who didn't feel comfortable to belong to such a Hasidic court with such strict rules. So they preferred to join into smaller Hasidic courts, which were also Hungarian in nature, such as Bobov, Popo, Vizhnitz, Tzansk, Luxembourg, other Hasidic courts, who, at least in the beginning, because they were smaller, they didn't have their own education system. So they used to send the kids to the Satmar education system, yet keep them in their own courts. So they are halfway in between. I mean, they adopted the ideology, and they adopted some of the of the social characteristics, but in terms of Hasidic behavior, they had their own perspective and their own Hasidic ideology, which was somewhat different to that of Satmar. So in that sense, they also developed some Hasidic nuances within the Hasidic community in New York.
Let me assert privilege as the moderator and ask a question, and that is, what is it? You able to discern anything specific about the Hungarian environment itself? What is it about Hungarian ultra-Orthodoxy that makes it, well, so extreme? Does it have any? Are there any correlates within, for example, Hungarian Christianity? Is there something about Hungary as sort of the linguistic odd man out in that part of the world that makes Hungary a special place because it's so different based on its language? What is it about Hungary? Is my question that produces such extremism, to use your word?
Okay, first of all, I want to mention that for almost all the questions that I was asked, and including that one, I have a special article dedicated to it, which is available at my academia.edu. So for those of you interested in more details, you can find, much broader answers to that question. Basically, when speaking about Hungary, we should remember that before the First World War, Hungarian Jewry was the second largest Jewry in Europe, second to the Russian Empire. Later came the Jewry of Galicia and Germany. But this is not what made it unique. What made it unique was a special immigration and settlement pattern, which was unlike any other country in Europe. In Hungary, there were three, which is quite a large country. There were three areas in which Jews settled, three separate areas within the country. And in each of those areas, there was a special type of Judaism, which was the most prevalent in that particular region. So there was one part which was mainly occupied by the modern Reform Jews, who in Hungary called Neolog. Mm-hmm. There was another part which was mainly occupied by non-Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox Jews who are more modern in the mindset, and there was another region in which there were more Hasidic Jews, and in which a different type of Orthodoxy, much more strict type of Orthodoxy developed. So because of those three areas were separated from one another, each one could take his views to the extreme. So in the beginning, there was a split between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox, and actually each one of them was allowed by the government to establish his own community. So in the same time, there could be a separate community for the non-Orthodox and a separate community for the Orthodox. This was a unique situation which didn't exist in any other European country, except for a few cities in Germany. And then after that split happened, there was another split between mainstream Orthodoxy, I mean that Orthodoxy on one side, which was more modern, and the extreme Orthodoxy, which was on the other side of the country, to which Rabbi Yoel belonged. And they too began to establish their own separate communities. So in the same location, there was one non-Orthodox community, and there were two Orthodox communities, one more lenient and one more zealous. So this is a phenomenon which happened only in Hungary. So this is in general what made Hungarian Orthodoxy in general more zealous than the rest of the Orthodox world in Eastern Europe.
But if I can pick up on it and maybe focusing specifically on Satmar, the specific part of Hungary changed many hands around between the wars, and I wonder if you see any connection between this between this idea of being a zealot and between the complete rejection of nationalism and the fact that this specific area was a major part of national wars and inhabited few very different nationalities. Till this day, they speak two different languages. There are two different cultures, both Romania and Hungary. I wonder if you see any connection between these circumstances and the rising of the Satmar Hasidism.
Yes, there is a connection. As I said, first of all, the rise of Satmar Hasidism is, in my mind, an American phenomenon. It's not directly related to what happened in Hungary. So, but as for your question, what I mentioned before, that Hungary was in fact divided into three areas in which different type of Jews lived. What happened during the First World War was that Hungary lost the war, and it lost some 2/3 of its former territory to other countries. So the areas in which the more radical Orthodox Jews lived, they were separated from Hungary, and one part was attached to Romania, and another part was attached to the newly established Czechoslovakia. And then you have two territories in which only the majority of Jews, not just Orthodox Jews, but the majority of the Jews in these territories were not only Orthodox Jews, but also extreme Orthodox Jews. So you had a large concentration of very extreme Jews. People who are there to extreme ideology, living in relatively small areas, which allow them to become even more zealous than before. So this is what drove those two communities. In one, in which the Satmar Rav was the main figure, but the other one was the Munkacher Rav, was also a known zealot, which I didn't have time to speak about.
Yeah, just before the war, I think Budapest has about 225,000 Jews. It's the second biggest Jewish city after Warsaw. But also among that group, among Budapest Jewry, there's also an extreme assimilationist camp, in every bit as extreme as the Satmar in their own directions, and a significant conversion rate as well to Christianity that go beyond just extremism. So it's just quite apparent that within Jewish life there may well be a center, but there are extremes, the likes of which don't have many parallels elsewhere. That's what makes it so interesting, I think. So one question here is from Dina Buchstein, wants to know what happened to the rest of the original family and the court in, she means in Hungary.
Well, actually, it was a relatively small. The Satmar court, the Satmar Rebbe was a descendant from an older lineage of old Hasidic dynasty of several dozen Hasidic Rebbes, all titled, all named Teitelbaum, which govern in several dozen towns and villages all over Hungary and Galicia. Most of them perished during the Holocaust. Some of them survived. Rabbi Yoel himself, he had 3 daughters, all of whom died before him without leaving heirs. He himself remarried to a younger woman, but she also wasn't able to bear children. So eventually he died without any heir, and he was succeeded by his nephew. So basically, this was his main family. The rest of the family, there were some distant relative members who were able to survive the Holocaust, but they didn't see great success after the war, save for one person who is known as the Tzanz Klausenburg Rebbe, who was also a sort of nephew, which was more successful after the war than before the war.
Okay, thanks. So I think we have a perfect question to end on, asked by Dr. Martin Smotrich, who simply asks, and it's quite a big one, what is the future of Satmar in America?
Well, I think that in looking backwards from the time it was established, maybe, I don't know, 80 years ago in America, we can see that one of the characteristics of Satmar and one of the secrets of its success, it's adaptability. I mean, they know how to, the court's leaders certainly know how to navigate that big ship of Jewish traditionalism within the modern world. They know exactly where to hold the line and where to let loose in order to keep as many Hasidim within the realms of the court as possible. So as long as this type of leadership is going to continue, I think that Satmar is going to strive. And the fact that now Satmar is split between two leaders, in fact, it's 2 separate courts, each naming itself Satmar, but under 2 leaders, is not a disadvantage in that court for that court future, because actually each one of those courts and each leadership, which takes a slightly different approach, is attacking the problem that each ultra-Orthodox community faces in the modern world a bit differently. So the fact that there are 2 of them just gives them a better chance of survival in the longer term.
Okay, great. There was one other question that just came in. It's just a very requires a short answer because we're running out of time. Was the Menachem Rebbe connected to Satmar in Hungary?
They were actually. He was connected in the sense that both of them held to the extreme Orthodox worldview. But on a personal level, they were bitter rivals. I mean, both of them fought for the title of who will be the greatest zealot. So there were actually a great animosity between them.
Okay, great. Menachem and Adi, thank you very much. This was a really lively and interesting discussion about a subject that most people don't know about, because most people don't know about Hungarian Jewish history, which is a real pity. And thank you for enlightening us on this one aspect of that fascinating history. And we are very grateful for you for coming here, or for being here, and for agreeing to give a talk for the Center for Jewish Studies. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
John and Adi, thank you very much. And thank the audience for the very interesting questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just keep an eye out on the CJS website, everyone, for upcoming events. And we'll have more interesting talks for you in the not too distant future. Okay, that's it. Have a good evening, everybody.